Horns up, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuning into the Deep in the Heart of Longhorns podcast. We're live. This is a one take, so I'm not going to go back and edit that. Uh, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We're continuing this journey to 100 subscribers. But before we get into our talk today on the Longhorn football team, joining me from Austin, Texas, the Stat King himself, Mr. Michael Ween. How you doing?
I'm doing well. We are 58 days from today away from the home opener against Rice for Texas football on September 2nd, meaning we are 65 days, just over 2 months away. I think come this Saturday, we'll be exactly 2 months away from the big game going to Tuscaloosa playing Alabama in the big non-conference game. Texas's last year in the Big 12. As recruiting is ramping up, recruiting momentum is currently on fire right now for the 2024 class. We're going to have a lot more content as we head into fall camp here in a couple weeks. More segments regarding the Texas football team, previewing the season, previewing the Big 12 as a whole, talking about Oklahoma, how Texas stacks up against this conference. They were just picked today to at the top of the Big 12 media preseason poll, the first time they've been at the top of that thing since 2009, which was the year that they ended up going to the national championship and losing to Alabama when Colt McCoy got hurt. There's the Big 12 preseason, all Big 12 preseason team that was just announced yesterday. Big 12 media days are coming up. SEC media days are coming up. There's so much going on in Longhorn land, in addition to wrapping up the Texas basketball off season. They just got probably their last piece added today with another big time transfer. We'll be talking about that. MLB draft is this weekend, and a bunch of Longhorns are going to be drafted. So we'll get to that at some point. A lot to be tuned into. If you love the Longhorns, you're in the right place. And even if you don't, but you just want to hear some college football talk, you want to hear about the Longhorns, you might hate them, but you just want to hear what our takes, you are in the right place. So go like and subscribe. And you have a lot to look forward to, in addition to on our main feed where we have a bunch of basketball offseason content coming. An episode should be released tomorrow or the next day, in addition to all of our NFL preseason coverage and all of that stuff. So get ready. But with that being said, today we are doing a pressure meter segment. This should be very fun, and I expect some really interesting conversations to come out of it for about the next 45 or so minutes. So with that, we've picked out 5 figures to talk about and rate on a pressure meter, 1 to 10, 10 being like on the hot seat, or there is a ton of pressure applied to this particular person this coming season or group of people. 1 being there's not really any pressure. I don't think there probably is not going to be any 10s, but there's also probably not going to be any 1s, 2s, or 3s. It's all going to be somewhere in between if I had to guess, but I could be wrong. So let's get the conversation started with the head man being Steve Sarkisian. And you can take this really in any context that you want, but Emmy, how much pressure is on Steve Sarkisian in 2023, in your opinion?
Well, it mostly comes down to player development and seeing the vision of his offense come to fruition on the field. We've seen glimpses of it. We've seen, stretches of it within a game, particularly in the first 3 quarters. That's part of it as well. You got to close games. But I think the hot seat would be a lot harder if these recruiting classes weren't so loaded. I think the fact that he's bringing in all of these top recruits from all over the country. We've talked about this before, him going out into different states and winning these recruiting battles. If that wasn't the case, then we'd be looking at a different situation. But I think There's reason to believe that Chris Del Conte is going to let things play out and have Steve Sarkisian at least have a chance to coach while Arch Manning is playing, with him being, his most touted recruit, highly anticipated recruit. But if things go south, of course, Texas is known, for being a premier football program, and the expectations are high each and every year. And the expectations haven't quite been.
Yeah. When I think about the pressure meter on Steve Sarkisian for 2023, I'm thinking about how good recruiting has been since he got to Texas. See, one of the big differences between Steve Sarkisian and past head coaching regimes at Texas, with Charlie Strong and with Tom Herman in particular, was Tom Herman actually recruited at a pretty high level. The difference now is not only is Sarkisian able to recruit in state better than Herman was. That was Herman's biggest issue, is he didn't win a lot of the big battles going on in state for a lot of the elite super blue chip prospects, meaning high 4-star or 5-star prospects in the state of Texas, which when you are the flagship university in Texas, you are the premier football program in Texas, you can't be losing a lot of those recruiting battles to other schools, whether those are in Texas, like the Texas A&Ms and Baylor's of the world, or, Oklahoma a lot of times would come poach guys. LSU would come poach guys. That was one of the bigger differences between Herman and Sarkisian and Charlie Strong in past head coaching regimes, aside from Mac Brown, is that Herman really struggled to recruit the elite guys in the state of Texas. But not only that, Herman did not recruit the offensive line and defensive line particularly well. And we've seen that. We've kind of seen the remnants of that, the remnant effects of that here the past couple of years up until last year, when the offensive line actually played pretty well, above average, I would say, for the first time in a long time. Sarkisian is recruiting the offensive and defensive lines at an elite level. And when you look at the guys that are out there right now and who they're targeting in the 2024 recruiting class, the offensive and defensive lines are only going to get better between now and December, when signing day is. I expect a lot of people throughout the industry in recruiting expect. So that's the biggest difference, and those are the biggest reasons why Herman was fired, was because he did not do a good job of recruiting the state of Texas, and he did not do a good job of building the trenches. He actually did a really good job of building everywhere else. Pretty good job, I should say. But I think when you look at Steve Sarkisian, I think if you told Texas fans, so he checks the recruiting box, but I think if you told Texas fans that with as much talent as this Texas roster has had, even with the guys that were left with Sarkisian from Herman's tenure, if you would have told Texas fans that through 2 years in the Big 12, which is not the toughest conference in the world, that his overall record coaching this football team would be 13-12 with no bowl wins, when Herman in his 4 years at Texas went 50-32, that's a 64% winning percentage, with 4 bowl wins, one of which being a Sugar Bowl win over Georgia. I'm not saying that Texas shouldn't have gotten rid of Herman. The program wasn't really in a good spot. The culture wasn't in a good spot. But I think if you told Texas fans that a couple years ago when they hired Sarkisian, they would have considered it a failure to this point. And I think a lot of people do. I'm putting the pressure meter at about a 6.5, 7 this upcoming season for Sarkisian to have a successful year. Meaning I think Texas has to win 9 or 10 games, and they have to at least play in the Big 12 championship game. I don't think he gets fired after this season, no matter what happens, because you have all this recruiting momentum and you're moving to another conference next year. And I think Texas, when they hired Sarkisian, not that they knew like they were definitely going to the SEC, but they wanted to have him for the first 4 years just in case. And now they're definitely giving him that first year in the SEC. So I think 6.5, 7, there is some pressure there to win 9 or 10 games, get to the Big 12 championship, at least, maybe win it. I think if he wins it, a lot of the pressure for the first couple years in the SEC will be relieved. But if this season goes south for whatever reason, the birds will start to chirp a little bit moving into the first year in the SEC. So there's a lot there. I know that was a mouthful, but that's sort of why Herman was fired. And that's why people are drawn to Steve Sarkisian, because he's been able to recruit so well. And I think after this year's recruiting class, and we'll talk about this in future episodes where we're going to talk about this Texas roster as a whole and do some fun segments with that. This is about as deep and balanced a Texas football roster that you can find in the past 10 years. So there's a lot there, but I'm putting it about a 6.5 for this year.
No, I would say a 7. It's right in that range. What do you think is the cutoff for, okay, he's out in terms of wins this season?
I mean, I think if it's anything less than what it was last year, when it was 8-5, when they really got beat up in the bowl game. I mean, that final score was, I think, a lot closer than what the game actually was. And I know there was no Bijan Robinson, no Roschon Johnson, that sort of thing. And guys sit out bowl games, and it's kind of hard to say. And we saw good things for Quinn Ewers, who we're going to talk about next. I don't think there's a cutoff this year. I think anything less than an 8-win season from what he did last year would be considered a huge disappointment. It would at least get the Texas brass talking about that first year in the SEC. And if things go south first year in the SEC, then I think he's definitely out the year after that. I think if Texas regresses back to 5-7 or something along those lines, like they were in that first year, maybe you see something happen, but I just don't see it with them changing conferences and with all this recruiting momentum going into, next year. So I don't know. I don't think he's really on the hot seat, but there is internal pressure there. And I think if you ask Sark, he's probably putting, I mean, he might not say it directly, but he's probably putting pressure on himself. I mean, he's a pretty smart guy. He kind of knows the situation. He listens to the media. He knows what they're saying, even if he doesn't admit it. I think internally, just within that room, he's putting pressure on himself. So with that, I mean, there's really nothing else to be said there. We can talk about our next pressure meter candidate, that being the quarterback, Quinn Ewers. So I will hand the floor to you to talk about Quinn Ewers.
We've hit on this conversation before, but for Quinn Ewers, it really just comes down to consistency. And I also just think some of the intangible stuff will just come naturally just because of his physical ability and what he can do with his arm, what he can do with his legs. Some of those things will come naturally through experience. I think this coming year, the improvements are expected. It's not a it's an expectation is what I'm trying to say. But what he can do beyond that is what I'm looking for. I think little things here and there in terms of playmaking ability, getting outside the pocket. Those are the type of things that are going to help your draft stock for him individually, and that's definitely something that's going to be swirling around throughout the year. Whether Texas fans want to admit it right now or not, or whether draft analysts want to admit it right now or not, this guy has the talent to be a first round pick. So if he goes out there and plays the way he's capable, the way he played in the first, quarter and a half against Alabama, then Texas will be right there in the Big 12.
Yeah, it's hard to say with Quinn. He's done a lot of good work this offseason. From all the reporting that I read, from everything that I hear, and I consider myself pretty plugged into the Longhorn football community, the Longhorn football, all this stuff that goes on. There was a picture released 3 or 4 days ago with all the Texas quarterbacks standing next to one another, with their shirts off. And not to get weird on this podcast, but a lot of people were surprised by how good, how muscular, I should say, that Arch Manning looked, and how skinny Quinn Ewers looked. He's really slimmed down, and I agree with your take on the playmaking from a playmaking standpoint. Getting outside the pocket, even using his legs more than he did last year. But I think there was sort of a fear last year after that Alabama game and getting hurt and having the shoulder lingering. But
Right.
this year, with a full offseason to prepare, a lot of learning experience to learn from, I expect him to use his legs and get outside the pocket a lot more. And I think this offensive line will be better, which will help that. The biggest thing for me, though, is consistency with his footwork and mechanics within the pocket and improving his accuracy. Because when you look at his freshman year, 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, turnovers really weren't an issue. Overall, I thought he took pretty good care of the football, considering there were other struggles. Most of the struggles came down to accuracy and inconsistency with his footwork, and some decision making. But I think those things are growing pains that most freshman quarterbacks go through. If your name's not Caleb Williams, and with all of Quinn's talent, we saw it second half of the bowl game. Although that game, I don't think was as competitive as the final score showed. But we saw Quinn flash in the bowl game, and that was a good finish to his year, even though Texas lost that game. We saw what happened in the Alabama game, obviously. We saw what happened in the OU game with that tight seam throw down the seam to Jatavion Sanders for a touchdown, where he threw for, I think it was over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, albeit against a bad OU defense. But I mean, you gotta beat the opponent that's across from you, right? It's the 58% completion percentage last year that really bothers me the most. When you look at the elite quarterbacks in college football, they're completing close to 68, 70% of their passes, especially when they have the weapons that Texas has. I mean, this receiving core this year, we're not going to talk about it specifically today, but Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington, A.D. Mitchell, Jatavion Sanders, Jonte Cook, the list goes on of highly recruited, proven, talented guys. A.D. Mitchell, being a guy who's caught 4 touchdowns in the college football playoff, and his experience and comes from the best program in the country, Georgia, right now. And I'm not even mentioning a guy like Isaiah Nayor, who transferred in from Wyoming last offseason, but tore his ACL in fall camp. It wasn't even on the field last year. If he gets healthy, I mean, this receiving class goes 6 or 7 deep. So I think the pressure's at about an 8, primarily because I think the expectation is throughout everywhere is that he has a really good season and is a first round or maybe early second round pick at the worst in next year's draft. Because if he's not, well, that just throws off the timing of the Texas quarterback room. I think the expectation is that Arch Manning redshirts this year, maybe gets into a couple games, though, if in garbage time, which there should be a lot of that. Texas lives up to their expectation. And I think Malik Murphy gets his opportunity next year to start and compete, really have a QB competition next spring, going into next fall, going into the SEC. This year, they posed it as a QB competition because they didn't want Malik Murphy or not Arch Manning, but Malik Murphy, a guy as valuable as that, to transfer. They wanted him to believe that he was in the competition with Arch Manning and Quinn Ewers for at least the backup position, which he is in right now. But it was really all along Quinn Ewers' job. Sark knew it. The coaching staff knew it. The team knows it. This is Quinn's team for 2023.
Right.
So bottom line is he needs to elevate his play, especially in the accuracy department and consistency department. But the good thing is he's not lacking for talent. If he just puts that all together, this Texas football team, honestly, the sky's the limit if your quarterback plays at an elite level. And we've seen that. You don't have to have the best defense. You don't necessarily even have to have the best offensive line. If your quarterback is elite, look at USC last year. Their defense was awful. I'm not saying Quinn's going to reach a Caleb Williams level, but if you're in like the Heisman running and your quarterback is really, really good, this Texas team will go as far as Quinn takes it. So that's really all I have to. I mean, we've said it on past podcasts. That's really all there is to say there.
Yeah, and to your point about completion percentage, if you want to have any type of competency on offense, you can't miss the layups. The most frustrating part about some of what happened last year is Quinn Ewers would have, crossing route over the middle of the field, receiver in space, open field in front, and then for whatever reason wouldn't put the ball quite on the money, and then it would just throw off the entire play, whether the receiver caught it or not. It would throw off the run after catch. It would throw off everything about it. And that's where he's got to be sharper. Just get the simple plays and everything else will come easier.
The last thing I'll say on Quinn is I do think the communication and the chemistry between him and, say, a Xavier Worthy, which was the biggest talking point last year, was the miscommunications between him and Xavier Worthy and the drop balls by Xavier Worthy. For a guy as talented as Xavier Worthy, a guy who for the past 2 years, for his first 2 years of his career, leads the Big 12 in both yards and touchdowns despite all these drops. I mean, he's that talented. And he produces at such a high rate. The drops were mind-boggling last year. But I do think some of that will get fixed. I think they have better receivers this year. Jonte Cook is a guy I think is going to make an immediate impact. I'll talk about him a little later when we talk about the recruiting class and some of the freshmen. A.D. Mitchell, as I already said, he's proven. Jatavion Sanders, I think, could be a second-round draft pick in next year's draft. I mean, I think he has the potential to be the second best tight end in next year's draft behind Brock Bowers with what he does this upcoming season. I mean, he's got it all. So I think some of those miscommunication playbook issues will be fixed. It just comes down to fixing the accuracy, hitting the layups, hitting on more of those deep shots down the field. And things will take care of themselves from there. So with that being said, let's talk about the offensive line. And I'll just start us off, and then I'll hand it to you for your opinions. In case you don't know, Texas has all 5 of their starters coming back, but I think one of them still might be hurt to start the season. So they're going to have 4 of their 5 starters from last year to start the year. Going left to right, Kelvin Banks, all Big 12 as a freshman. I think he was like a second-team All-American. Really, really good 5-star from the 2022 recruiting class, which was a big offensive line recruiting class. The rate he's going with his freshman season and how good he is, all the Pro Football Focus analytics grade him out to be like a top 10 pick in the 2025 draft. He's that good. He could be the best tackle in that draft class. He is already one of the premier left tackles in the country. You have Hayden Connor, who was pretty good at left guard last year. Jake Majors at center, a really experienced guy. Either Cam Williams or DJ Campbell, both again from the 2022 recruiting class, the big offensive line class, starting at right guard. And then Christian Jones, the 6-year senior, who was really good at right tackle last year. So that's how it's set up right now. You have more depth because of the recruiting. This Texas offensive line was really good in pass protection last year. Quinn and the other quarterbacks that played didn't really get sacked all that often, and they were pretty well protected aside from a couple of games. And that happens, but this offensive line as a whole in pass protection was really good, and people are expecting that to continue, if not get a lot better this upcoming season. I think there's some high expectations for this Texas offensive line, considering how much returning talent that they have, considering that they have an All-American candidate at the left tackle position and potentially a first-team All-Big 12 candidate at the right tackle position. And a lot of high 4-star, 5-star guys on the interior offensive line. Guys who may not have the most experience in the world, but have the talent to get it done. And with Kyle Flood, with how good he's recruited the offensive line and how good he's coached these guys up to be, there's a lot of pressure. I think most of it, though, is in the running game. Losing Bijan Robinson and losing Roschon Johnson, losing those guys who could make the best of what they had, even if it wasn't perfect up front in the run blocking schemes, especially going up the middle. That's something I noticed a lot last year. Is there were times where Texas really struggled to run in between the tackles. They were good at running outside the tackles because of how good Christian Jones and Kelvin Banks were, but running inside the tackles, especially against TCU and some of these better defenses in the Big 12, was a hassle last year. I think that's where this Texas offensive line has to improve the most. I think it's probably at about a 7 for the offensive line. There's some pretty high expectations for this offensive line to be a top 15, top 20 offensive line in the country, one of the better offensive lines in the Big 12 with how much returning talent that they have. And that's really all I can say. It's hard to gauge, though, because we just don't know what will happen with the health. Texas went through a full season last year up until the very end with a fully healthy, all 5 guys starting on that offensive line. That doesn't always happen year to year. So you hope they continue to stay healthy, but that's something out of your control. But I do think there is a good amount of pressure on the offensive line to meet at least the expectations that have been set.
Definitely. And one of the things that I had thought about before we started this episode is I'm glad that we decided to go in this direction with this conversation, going in terms of the offensive line rather than the running back room, because a lot has been said about Roshan Johnson and obviously Bijan Robinson leaving the program, heading to the NFL. But right now, for the Texas running game, the focus has to be on the offensive line because that group, as you said, there's been a lot of um, resources put into it. There's been a lot of recruiting talent that has come in, and year two of this group now it's time to step up and perform. And also on top of that, going into the SEC conference, who's known for being far more physical in the middle of every defense in the SEC, pretty much. So setting that tone in the last year in the Big 12 of being a dominant group, I think is extremely important.
Right. I think a lot of the pressure that is unnecessarily being applied to the running back room coming into this season, although I will say there is some pressure there. I mean, it's not like the running backs are freed of pressure.
Right.
Texas has still one of the more talented running back rooms in the entire country, definitely within the Big 12. Still, with Bijan Robinson and with Roshan Johnson leaving, who in fact did account for 87% of their rushing yards last year. But Texas has like the talent to get it done if there is a good offensive line in place. Jonathan Brooks is a guy that we've seen in games before. CJ Baxter, the 5-star freshman running back out of Edgewater, Florida, comes in. And he's a guy who's probably not at the Bijan Robinson level. He has a little bit different of a skill set, but is still a really, really talented running back that is high level in pass protection. That's one of the best things about him right now as a freshman. And he's already probably the best pass blocking running back on the entire roster coming in as a freshman. And we heard that coming out of spring ball. You have a bunch of other guys there. That Jadon Blue, the 4-star guy from a couple of years back. The list goes on and on, right? A lot of that unnecessary pressure being applied to the running backs needs to be applied to the offensive line. But it still goes both ways, if that makes sense. But
Right.
again, we'll talk about this more down the line when we talk about this roster as a whole. I do think there are, just looking at the talent as a whole, excluding Kelvin Banks, who's barring some significant bad injury, will be a top 10 pick in that 2025 draft. Outside of him, though, I still think there are multiple guys who, if they play up to their talent, are NFL level offensive linemen. And that's something we haven't been able to say about Texas in a long time. Only 2 offensive linemen drafted in, I think, the past 10 to 12 years. And for a program like Texas, that's pretty bad. So I think that's being fixed, and credit to Sark in this recruiting staff for fixing that. But yeah, I do think there's a good amount of pressure there. But this is the first year in a while where there's actual expectations for this offensive line, this group as a whole, to be one of the better offensive lines in college football. There was a lot of talent last year, but you had 3 freshmen starting, and it was like, oh boy, how is this going to go? It ended up working out just fine. There were some growing pains along the way, but this year there's real expectation there, and we'll leave the conversation at that. Let's go ahead and talk about the defense really fast. Pete Kwiatkowski, their defensive coordinator, guy Sark hired from Washington when he was hired in January of 2021, 2 years ago. was highly scrutinized in his first year after Texas finished 99th in college football in scoring defense and 100th in total defense. In Sarkisian's first year, there was a lot of heat on Pete Kwiatkowski after that year. This year, though, this past year, Texas defense actually played some good football. And we saw that they were 27th nationally in scoring defense, up from 99th. And good in a lot of other categories. The problem was there were a lot of breakdowns in big plays that cost them in some of their bad losses. The one to Texas Tech comes to mind. The one to Oklahoma State also comes to mind. And the defense created a lot of pressure, but they're still not, forcing enough turnovers and creating enough havoc in the backfield. So there are areas of improvement, but I think coming off of the way this Texas defense played last season, and with how much returning talent that we expect to get better that they have with Barron Sorrell at the edge position, Tavondre Sweat on the interior, if those two guys have good years, they're going on to the NFL draft next year as sort of mid-round picks. Jalen Ford being picked as the preseason Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year in the media polls. Jahdae Barron was a guy who had 3 or 4 interceptions last year and is one of the better players in the secondary. The secondary is deep with talent, and it's only getting deeper with these recruiting classes. This could be one of the better Texas secondaries that we've seen ever. So there is pressure to, I think, at least sustain and not regress significantly from what they were a year ago. There are some different pressure areas specifically throughout the defense, like in particular, edge rushers are under a lot of pressure this year. Barron Sorrell needs to step up, although he was their best edge rusher last year. He's got to step up his game. And then the guy opposite that, whether that be Ethan Burke, the guy out of Westlake, or Colton Bassick, or whoever it might be, there's a lot of pressure on this defensive line / edge rush group to be more disruptive in the backfield and to hit quarterbacks more, force more turnovers. And that's only going to make, if they can create that amount of pressure that they want to and get those sacks, force the ball out quicker, cause disruption in the backfield, that's going to create a lot more opportunities for a really talented secondary. So in terms of Kwiatkowski himself, I think with the significant improvement that we saw last year, I don't think the pressure meter is significantly high. I think it's probably around a 6.5. But you don't want to see regression or significant regression this upcoming season. So I don't know. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about the defense more as a whole later on when we get closer to fall camp. But I just want to see them sustain what they were able to establish last year, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I saw it as more so being like a 5.5, 6 range. So pretty much the same thing. But to me, it comes down to two things. One thing that we've seen around the NFL in recent years is the rise in paying pass rushers. And we've talked about it on the show before. A lot of the times, pass rushing, having a consistent pass rush, that plays a huge part in being able to get key stops late in games. Exhibit A, why did the Bills sign Von Miller? He's a closer. He's going to, if you need a stop on 3rd and 8 with 20 seconds left, Von Miller's going to go out there and make a play. He's one of the best pass rushers of all time. So in case of Texas, it comes down to, one, getting a consistent pass rush, as you mentioned. And number two, I think they have a fourth quarter mindset problem. Whether they're in the lead or they're not, it just seems like a lot of the guys on their defense get trapped into, oh, I got to go make a play. And then with that, they lose discipline on their assignment. For example, a edge player, not keeping contained, giving up a big run, or a safety not staying deep enough, giving up a big pass play down the middle. Whatever the case may be, it was a lot of that last year, especially fourth quarter in tight games. So this year, I want to see that addressed. And I just want to see these Texas defenders being confident enough and assured enough to not fall into that trap.
Yeah. Look, Texas actually led the country in quarterback pressures last year, but they were 71st in sacks with 27. They were right in the company with programs like North Texas and Texas State in terms of the amount of sacks that they got last year and the amount of times they were bringing down the quarterback, getting to the quarterback. Nothing against North Texas or Texas State. Those are good football programs, but that's got to be better with the talent that this Texas team has. I'm really looking at Barron Sorrell, though, as a guy who should creep close to double-digit sacks this year. If he doesn't do that, it's going to be rough. It's going to be concerning because there is a lot of unproven. It's high-level talent, but a lot of unproven talent on the other side. So unless someone on the other side significantly steps up, which we're still hoping happens, but if they don't significantly step up and Barron Sorrell doesn't take another jump, the pass rush that you're talking about, the pass rush that we're talking about, isn't going to come to fruition. So I'm really looking at Barron Sorrell as a guy that creeps close to double-digit sacks. And we're about to talk about some freshmen in this 2023 recruiting class. But Anthony Hill Jr., the 5-star linebacker out of Denton, Texas, right outside of Dallas, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, he's a guy who is sort of in the fight for the starting position, or at least the middle linebacker rotation next to Jalen Ford. But he's a guy that I think you could at least see on the field making an impact in situations where you maybe need to create a little extra pressure, because that's one of his specialties, is being able to rush from the interior and put him on the edge. He can create pressure there. I think that's a lot of where you'll see Anthony Hill deployed this upcoming season. Since he is so talented, he could help in the pass rush as well. And we'll see probably Kwiatkowski deploy him in those ways. And there are other guys there too that, last year, this past recruiting class, the 2023 class that we're about to talk about here in a second, it was one of the better linebacker classes Texas has signed in the past 20 years, if not the best, headed by Anthony Hill himself. So, there are some different conversations to be had there. We'll have them down the line. One thing more that I wanted to mention with regards to this Texas defense, and then we'll move on, is that Gary Patterson played a big part in what this Texas defense was able to do. He's not there anymore. Now, they made some other hires that I think will be good, and I think this Texas defense now has enough experience and enough returning talent to still be able to sustain that without Gary Patterson being there. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least mention that Gary Patterson is no longer there. So we'll just have to see if that has any effect at all on this defense. That's all I got to say. So we will wrap this thing up for the next 5 or so minutes by talking about the 2023 recruiting class. These guys are going to be freshmen this year. Most of them will probably not play this year because there's so much returning talent coming back. But I think some of the higher level guys, the Jonte Cooks of the world, the Cedric Baxter, CJ Baxter, the running back that I mentioned earlier, will get into the rotation on offense. I think you'll probably see Anthony Hill, maybe a Malik Muhammad, the high 4-star corner, could get some reps. I think some of these higher level guys will start to get reps this year. I think you could even see Arch Manning in a game or two. You can play in 4 games and still take that redshirt season. I think you could see him get some reps late in some blowout games. But with regards to this season, there's not much pressure at all on the 2023 recruiting class. I think there is some expectation that some of those guys I just mentioned make somewhat of an impact their freshman year. But as a whole, this recruiting class isn't in much pressure at all going into this season. But I think going down the line, going into the SEC with a program that was deemed by many to be program changing, paradigm shifting, with the Arch effect, of course, everyone knows what that is. Everyone wants to play with Arch Manning. Yeah, the pressure is going to get elevated going into next year when a lot of these guys are starting to see the field more. There's no real number I can put on it right now because I don't know what the situation is going to look like next year. I mean, some of these guys, it's just how college football works. There's attrition every year. Some of these guys will transfer out next year. Not the higher level guys, but some of the guys who can get better opportunities elsewhere will transfer out. But I think going into the SEC next year, if I had to make an educated guess, the pressure meter would be somewhere around a 6 or a 7. But right now, there's just an expectation that a couple of these guys make somewhat of an impact on this year's team.
Yeah, agree. There's not a whole lot to be said here, but it was worth mentioning just because of the sheer amount of talent that was brought in. That had to be spotlighted in some way, shape, or form. And for this segment in particular, really the only scenario where I see, this team, exceeding even Big 12 championship expectations and maybe like being in the hunt for a playoff berth, dare I say. That's a little much, I know, but the only scenario where I see that is if those guys you just mentioned make an impact, because you're going to have to see some people step up from spots where players get injured or battles be won in training camp and the preseason before the season starts, and guys step up in that way as well.
Right. Yeah. We'll see what happens. Look, a lot more talk on the freshman class, a lot more talk on this roster as a whole. I think one of the interesting conversations that Emmy and I are going to have down the line sometime soon in the month of July is going to be looking at the top, who we think going into the season are like the top 5 players on this roster, and how many NFL draft picks do we foresee going into next year? How many NFL guys for 2024 are on this roster? That's something that could tell us a lot about this Texas football team. And then we'll start to get into, as the 24 recruiting keeps going, and we'll have a lot of content on that as well. We'll start to get into our preseason previewing stuff. But keep it tuned here for all your Longhorn football and all your Longhorn sports talk, whether you're a fan of the Longhorns like we are, or you're just interested in hearing about college football, or just interested in hearing about Texas in general. Because I know a lot of people, while they may hate Texas, still like to listen to people talk about Texas. That's just how it goes, because Texas is Texas. So thank you guys for listening. Again, there is an NBA episode coming soon very soon, in the next 24 to 48 hours. A lot's been going on. But with all that being said, for Emmy,
There's just one more thing. We got a couple of chats over the course of the episode. So Justin Hutchinson, shout out to you, wrote in and said the most pressure is on Quinn. Our passing game got to be on point to kickstart the run game for a deep run. I mean, pretty much on point with what we hit on. Shout out to you. And I wish we would have caught on to that chat sooner so we could have pointed it out while you were still here. But no matter the case, thanks for listening.
yeah, shout out Justin. Justin was his name, right?
Yeah.
Shout out. I totally agree. In years past with the backfield that Texas had, I think it was a lot of running to set up the pass. This year, I think you could see more of passing to set up the run. And that in itself puts more pressure on the quarterback. And I do agree. We actually put a poll out on our Raw Prospect podcast social feed, Twitter in particular, that asked that question. And I do agree that it is Quinn Ewers. So shout out to him for listening. I thought that was a great segment. We'll definitely be bringing this pressure meter segment back on other podcasts in the future. But with all that being said, for Emmy and all Texas fans, 58 days out from the season, and for myself, Mr. Michael Ween, just like the chances of the Texas football hype train not existing going in to fall camp and going into the season, we are going, gone. Peace out and hook 'em horns.
Horns up.